Hey, I want to welcome you all to episode 34, the second installment of Utopolis One. And it overlaps with Spirit Seekers, kind of, as well, so I will put it on both playlists. Today's topic, the illusion that is free will, and the evidence that backs this up. One little disclaimer, some people tend to experience this fact as very unpleasant, possibly resulting in mild depression. If you recognize yourself in this, it is up to you whether or not to watch this video, but I did warn you. I personally prefer truth over comfort anyway, but that choice is for everyone to make for oneself. I think it's time to start, not that I have a choice in the matter. Here we go with number 34. So the illusion of free will. The question whether we have a free will has kept philosophers, psychologists and psychiatrists quarreling since the moment they thought of the concept. And it is a very existential question, of course. It permeates all aspects of life, our beliefs, our customs, our ethics, our self-esteem, our motivation, sense of guilt, shame and accomplishment. The list is endless, basically. And there are definitely multiple viewpoints one can take in looking at this dilemma. But let's first create the dilemma. Is free will an illusion? I think this conclusion is inescapable, and in actuality, when you look at it from a bird's eye view, the fact that we even still entertain the notion in the days of modern science seems preposterous. But there's a good and understandable reason behind that. Now, well, whether it's good or not, we'll get to that. From your perspective, you now have the choice to either continue watching this video or not to do that. At least that is certainly how it appears to be. And you do have a choice. What choice you're going to make, however, is in a way already determined. Because what forms the decision you will make? What are the reasons behind it? The list is very long, of course. The brain you were born with, the education you got, the way your parents raised you, the values you learned, previous videos you've seen that this video reminds you of, and all previous experiences you had up until this point, basically. So basically your whole life, in all its aspects, together, determine what you will choose. So it's deterministic, it's a cause and effect thing, just like everything in our universe. We've agreed with each other on the fact that we live in a universe of cause and effect, and our behavior is no exception to this. Its determinants are just many in number and super complex, obscuring this relationship a little. So a million factors weigh in on what you will choose, and if you look at this honestly, the bulk of those factors were not things you chose yourself. You didn't choose what country and what parents you would be born to, at least not that you remember. And from that moment on, all your behavior is already beginning to be determined by outside factors.
Now, you could consider a generic serial killer. Okay, his choice to commit his last murder was determined by neurophysiological events in his brain, which were in turn determined by prior causes. Bad genes, the developmental effects of an unhappy childhood, a night of lost sleep because a car alarm was going off down the street. Okay, these events precede any conscious decision to act. So what does it mean to say that this murderer committed his crime of his own free will? Okay, if this statement means anything, it must mean that he could have behaved differently. He could have resisted the impulse to commit the murder, or he could have declined to feel the impulse altogether. And not on the basis of some random influences over which he had no conscious control, but because he was actually the conscious author of his thoughts and actions. Now, the problem is no one has been able to describe a way in which mental and physical events could arise that would make sense of this claim of freedom. Now, when we assume that violent criminals have such freedom, of course, we reflexively blame them for their actions. But when we look at this wider net of causality, the basis for placing blame seems to evaporate. The moment we catch sight of a stream of causes that reach back into childhood and beyond, the sense of his culpability begins to disappear. And to say that he would have done otherwise, or could have done otherwise, had he chosen to, is simply to say he would have lived in a different universe had he been in a different universe. Now, as sickening as I might find such a person's behavior, I have to admit that if I were to trade places with him, atom for atom, I would be him. There's no extra part of me that could resist the impulse to victimize innocent people. And even if you believe that every one of us harbors an immortal soul, this problem of responsibility remains. I cannot take credit for the fact that I don't have the soul of a psychopath. So if I had truly been in this person's shoes, if I had his genes and life experience and an identical brain or an identical soul in an identical state, I would have behaved as he did, and for the same reasons.
This explains why, from our conscious perspective, it seems like we have a choice when we are making a choice. While in fact the reasons that determine what choice you will make are all already in place and were out of your control when they entered your life. So we have a choice, but what we will choose is not our choice. It is dictated by our environment in the broad sense of the term. Hurts your brain, doesn't it? If we could make any choice we wanted, at random so to speak, we would go against the laws of the universe as we know it. After all, true randomness doesn't really exist. As the principle of cause and effect from the Kybalion, which we discussed 2 episodes ago, states, there is a cause for every effect and an effect for every cause. Randomness does not exist. It merely represents a law that we do not yet see and or understand. This is how we see the universe, so not to apply it to ourselves is short-sighted at best. Now let's do some introspection. Close your eyes and calm your mind as much as possible by listening very intently to my voice, for instance. Now I'm going to ask you something. Notice the next thought that occurs. No matter what came to mind, ask yourself, did I intend to have that thought, or did it just appear in consciousness outside of my control, in the same way an itch appears on your leg, for instance? If you observe your own thoughts closely enough, and if you're honest with yourself, you'll find the answer to that question to be a negative one. Either our wills are determined by prior causes we are not responsible for, or they are the result of chance, which we can't be responsible for. We presume responsibility for our thoughts and actions that is in fact illusory. So philosophically at least, there seems to be no way out of that. Let's see what science has to say. In a study from 1964 by Kornhuber and Deke, EEG measurements of brainwaves of participants who were asked to move their fingers 500 times when they felt like it were recorded, with subjective reports of when they started the movement consciously, measured through the press of a button. The signals started 300 to 400 milliseconds before the participants indicated they initiated the movement, and this has been repeated many times. Later, Libet et al. Did a replication, but instead asked participants to push the button when they started intending to move their finger, and still a time difference was found. The brain reacted around 150 milliseconds before people indicated they started intending to move. Now, the brainwave that initiated a movement are actually the readiness to move, is called a readiness potential, or a Bereitheitspotential in German. This shows itself as a steady increase of electric potential, which causes a signal to fire if it exceeds a certain threshold. And it was always argued that this was proof of the absence of a free will, but recently it was brought forward that this readiness potential could also be a cause of the intention to move starting at that moment, meaning the timing of our intention is influenced by the natural rising and falling of our brainwave activity, which would give us back some autonomy at least. And to complicate things even more, this could also be the case, or this could also be a case of precognition, which is quite likely actually. I'll get back to that in a bit. Truth remains, we simply don't know yet all the answers, so further evidence is needed to find out. More recent research by Schurger et al., where there was also a control condition in which people didn't move at all, seems to indicate that people's subjective experience of a decision, what Libet's study seemed to suggest was just an illusion, appeared to match the actual moment their brains showed them making a decision. This, however, doesn't prove that it is our will doing that, as I explained earlier. After all, the determinants of our choices lie mostly outside our control, and that is much harder to debunk, if not impossible. Another study by Matsuhashi and Hallett from 2008 repeated the experiments but eliminated the self-report aspect by randomly introducing tones that meant the subject had to stop moving. From this data and its event-related potentials, which are brainwaves coinciding with events, in this case sudden tones, it is possible to infer when the intention to move began. I'll spare you the specifics of this. If you are interested, you can find links to all these studies in the description. Now, the researchers found that the time of the conscious intention to move, t, normally occurred too late to be the cause of movement genesis. But it gets even more complicated. As I mentioned earlier, there is also a phenomenon called precognition, where the brain reacts to events before they occur. And this is a pretty rigorous finding across many experiments. Daryl Bem, who is most well known for this, as well as Dick Bierman, who happens to be the person that mentored me when I was writing my thesis. Some examples of their studies in the description, of course. Now, in these studies, generally the participants look at pictures appearing for a couple of seconds on a computer screen, which are randomly either neutral pictures or arousing pictures. While this happens, their brainwaves, or their EDR, electrodermal skin response, is measured, and this consistently shows the body reacting before the picture even appears on the screen. And not only that, it also, in the majority of cases, is congruent with the type of picture that will be shown, neutral or arousing, which seems to indicate that somehow the brain knows the future, or information travels back in time, is another way of putting it. As this graph here shows, the difference between the two signal averages is showing already before the onset of the stimulus, or the picture in this case. One of these represents the average of all neutral pictures, the other all arousing pictures. So now time creeps into the mixture of this mystery as well. It appears that the question of free will is becoming more complicated the deeper we dive into it. It all strikes me that some things obviously have to be redefined. I mean, our relation to time, for instance, is seen as an arrow straight forward, one-way traffic. I think it looks more like an infinity symbol, with the experiencer of time at its crossing in the center. Time flows forward to the future and then backwards to the present, continuing from there to the past and making a U-turn back to the present again, creating an eternal feedback loop, if you will, between past, present and future. Physics already agrees with this in part, formulating time as symmetrical as well. And intuitively it just makes sense. And not only that, it also kind of solves our free will problem, which is created in this case by a future that already exists, meaning all your future choices are already set. But when the future influences the present as well, after being determined by it, we get back some of our will, it seems. This doesn't solve the problem created by the arising nature of thoughts in consciousness, though, as we observed during introspection. There is another possibility, though, one that scientists tend not to consider, either because they didn't think of it or because they simply refuse to entertain the possibility. It is also possible that the scripts for our lives are already drawn out indeed, set in stone, while only seemingly under our own control because of the way we perceive things from inside the machine, so to speak. That our bodies are like trains in which we travel. We have no way of changing the direction, we are along for the ride. All we can do is observe. Done long enough, the distinction between passenger and vehicle fades as we start identifying ourselves with it, somewhere around age 3 or 4. And from a spiritual perspective, where we are here to learn or experience specific things, a world where everything is attuned to everything in one great master plan that gives all of the participants of this world the experiences they need, makes way more sense than a haphazard random process. A predetermined story to our lives would make such a pre-stimulus brain response, as observed in precognition, for instance, something to be expected instead of an anomaly. Now, science usually isn't too welcoming of notions like this, because a lot of these hypotheses cannot or are hard to be tested, at least not yet. But at the same time, if you truly follow the scientific method, in my opinion, you have to consider this option if you can't prove otherwise either. And we can't. If this set-in-stone theory is correct, this might even, in a way, potentially get some of our will back, as then the question is raised, who set it in stone, of course. Now the implications for society. Many people have always stated that even though free will seems an illusion, The general public should not be aware of this. And studies have shown that if you give participants a chance to steal during an experiment, and you tell one group beforehand that free will exists and the other group the opposite, those that are told that free will is an illusion steal more than those that don't. And while this may be the case, the notion can be seen as quite constructive as well, in my opinion. Hatred would become more difficult to rationalize. The most horrible people would have to be seen as unlucky for being in that body, in that brain, being victim to those choices. And the evidence of this is everywhere in daily life as well. Just look at situations of addiction, for instance. People here often do things they don't want or wish they didn't want. Might be a better way of putting it. From a perspective where free will is illusory, such a person is, instead of weak, a victim of his own non-constructive choices in spite of trying hard not to. That's why in the current way of looking at things, for most people it creates guilt, shame and all kinds of emotions that are, from this new perspective, not justifiable. And this guilt is often one of the reasons people keep feeling bad, with the result that they keep using. Another less obvious but fascinating example is the alien hand syndrome. This is a syndrome that affects people who have damaged their corpus callosum, the connective bridge between the two brain hemispheres, either through an accident or the removal of a tumor, for instance. Because the two halves no longer communicate, it can happen that people's non-dominant hand starts doing things they do not intend, causing, for instance, a tug-of-war between their dominant and non-dominant hands over what shirt to take out of the closet.
I had one patient who actually woke in the middle of the night attempting to strangle herself.
I remember I used to have to hit a table with a medical hammer, but I used to hit myself with it, everywhere.
The patient grabbed the syringe, the doctor turned his buttock to the patient, and the patient performed the injection.
I've even gotten mad at my hand because it won't do what it's supposed to do. Why are you doing this to me?
So these conflicts, these disagreements you see the left hand or the alien hand committing indicates that maybe there's another personality running around inside the brain.
My hand, it just seems to go out and it grabs it every time, and I don't know why. It's as though this isn't my hand.
The left hand doesn't want to do its job, so it has to get punished.
He would have a struggle, and it was obvious he wanted the light off, and his left hand was turning it on.
Bad hand.
Imagine having a part of your body that has a will of its own, not knowing what it's going to do next, causing you embarrassment or, worse still, physical harm. For people like Giuseppina, this is no mystery condition. Giuseppina suffers from a rare disorder known as alien hand syndrome. She's one of only a few patients around the world who, for one reason or another, end up with a hand that quite literally has a will of its own. She lives in Italy with her husband, John Carlos. They lived a normal, happy life together with their family, until one day, 14 years ago, Giuseppina suffered a stroke, which was to have a devastating effect on their lives.
May well be that a lot of people are experiencing a form of alien hand syndrome, but actually the local doctor hasn't yet realized it. So it might actually be a lot more common than we realize.
These people don't understand why. To them, this lady put stuff in her cart and now she doesn't want it.
He'll be telling it to do something, and it is not obeying.
It's very disobedient.
I tried to get dressed on my own, but I can't do it. If my husband isn't there to help me, I can't do anything by myself.
When I turn the pages of a newspaper or book, with one hand I turn the pages the right way, and with the other I turn them back.
This doesn't prove the absence of free will, but it does offer an example that the relationship between intent and acting on it is not as clear-cut as we think. What does this have to do with Utopolis One, you might ask? Realizations like the one we just discussed have major implications for all aspects of society, and will be one of many starting principles where the structure of this new model for society would be built upon. Instead of hatred, compassion can flow from this realization that free will is an illusion. It frees us in a way of our egocentric way of observing and brings us together, as we all influence each other's choices as we interact. Still though, this freedom is scary to many people who actually feel they would lose instead of gain something, maybe understandably so. But they fail to realize that experience doesn't change. We do experience choices and they are still important, but the action of choosing is in a deterministic way out of our control, in spite of what our experience tells us. That doesn't mean we don't still choose, because we do. Still though, this realization can and should have massive implications for the structure of society, especially when it comes to quote-unquote controlling unwanted behavior, not to mention ethics and the validity, in any case, to ask, is this morally good or bad? Because without free will, there is no such thing as making a choice between what is morally right or wrong, because there is no choice. What does exist is behaving in a morally correct way, because the impossibly complex process that is called your experience, or your life up until that point, has converged at that moment to act in this way or in that way. We should just be aware that our whole thought process is not something we consciously create. And if we are honest to ourselves, we have absolutely zero proof that any of our perceived intentions are actually causally linked to our behavior. Aside from the fact that even those intentions just appear in consciousness, outside of our control. Intention is not intentional. We do not choose to have thoughts, instead they are created or brought forth by the environment in the broadest sense, which includes your memories, previous experiences, etc. And in a way, haven't we always thought that our thoughts are a product of our experience? The shift isn't as huge as it at first appears to be. Thoughts, intentions, decisions flow from all previous experience up until that point in time, by means of neuronal potentials, some higher, some lower, increasing or decreasing chances of that neuron firing as a next signal is received. And no one can claim they are doing that on purpose. And with that, we have reached the end of this episode. Again, please like, share and subscribe. These last 3 weeks have been a steady increase in subscribers and views, and just wanted to let you know that I'm very grateful to you guys for this, for making this possible. And keep up the good work, of course. The next episode will be the first edition of Proof for the Paranormal, starting with an introduction to parapsychology. Now, I realized that after my rant in episode 23 about the difference between evidence and proof, it should be called Evidence for the Paranormal. But with such a pretty acronym, I couldn't resist. Until the next episode, stay healthy. Love y'all. Adieu.
Milkshake.